We would like to send out a special thanks to Best Fiends for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Best Fiends is a unique and exciting puzzle experience unlike other puzzle games out there. Best Fiends updates the game monthly with new levels and events, so it never gets old. You can download it free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. Thank you, and enjoy the show. May 16th, 1987. Denver, Colorado. After a collision with another vehicle, the unidentified driver of a pickup truck runs away from the accident scene. Police discover that the man was registered at a local motel under the name Larry Monroe, and the truck is registered to a 55-year-old California resident named Don Smith. 5 days earlier, Don had left on a road trip to visit relatives, and his murdered body is eventually discovered in a remote area of Idaho. Before his death, several witnesses saw Don in the company of a man matching the description of the mysterious Larry Monroe, but he is never found, and the actual circumstances of Don's murder remain unknown. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we'll be covering two cold cases which were featured on Unsolved Mysteries: the 1987 murder of Don Smith and the 1988 murder of Philip Fraser. There isn't a ton of material out there about either of these cases, which is why I decided to do a double feature episode. But while these cases are not connected, you will find a number of similarities between them. They each involve male victims who were in the midst of a lengthy road trip before they were murdered, and their bodies and abandoned vehicles would be found at separate locations. In both cases, it seems very likely that the perpetrator was an unidentified hitchhiker whom the victim picked up during their travels, but what makes these crimes a bit different from the norm is that the killers did not make much of an attempt to conceal their identities and openly interacted with multiple witnesses who distinctly remembered them. All things considered, these cases should have been solvable, but after 3 decades, neither of the perpetrators have been identified, and there are still a number of baffling unanswered questions about the circumstances of how these murders were carried out. Anyway, I'll start off the episode by discussing Don Smith's case, as well as providing my theories and analysis, and then I'll move on to Philip Fraser's murder. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now start off by delving into the unsolved murder of Don Smith. Our first story begins in 1987, and our first victim is 55-year-old Don Smith, who lives in Hemet, California with his second wife, Helen. Decades earlier, Don was married to a woman named Leota McCormick, and they had a daughter named Brenda, but the couple divorced shortly after the child was born. Brenda wound up being raised by her mother, and since Don and Leota did not get along, he would not be a part of his daughter's life as she was growing up. But when Leota passed away, Don and Brenda finally decided to seek each other out. By this point, Brenda was 26 years old and living in Idaho under the last name Walker, and she was a divorcee with 2 children. But once Don reunited with Brenda, they began what would become a happy relationship, and Don also became close with his grandchildren. However, Don would eventually battle cancer and became depressed because he was not well enough to work. So on May the 11th, Don decided to leave California on a cross-country road trip to visit relatives, which would include seeing his sister in Vancouver, Washington. His wife Helen was originally planning to go with him, but after she fell ill, Don went alone. He would make the trip in his 1984 Ford pickup truck camper while towing a 24-foot-long travel trailer, and he was also accompanied by his 2 Labrador retrievers. At some point, Don ran into problems with his trailer, so he made arrangements to leave it with a resident outside Las Vegas while he continued on with his trip. But within the next 5 days, Don would unexpectedly find himself in the middle of a bizarre, unsolved mystery. At around 2 a.m. on May 16th, an accident would take place at an intersection in downtown Denver, Colorado, when a pickup truck camper collided with another vehicle. The other motorist was surprised when the driver of the truck, an unidentified African-American man, immediately climbed out and ran away from the scene. The police soon arrived and searched the truck, where they found registration papers for Don Smith, as well as a bloody jack handle and a room key for a local motel. It turned out the room had been rented by someone who registered under the name Larry Monroe. When police looked inside, they discovered that the occupant had left behind a pair of pants and a sweatshirt which were covered in blood. Obviously, the black man seen running away from the truck was not Don Smith, and when his wife was notified about what was happening, she claimed she had not seen him since he left on his road trip. Don had also not yet shown up to visit his sister in Vancouver, Washington, so an official missing persons report was filed for him. Investigators would attempt to retrace Don's movements in order to figure out what happened to him. After dropping off his trailer in Las Vegas on May the 11th, the next confirmed sighting of Don took place over 600 miles north in Blackfoot, Idaho, the following day. Don's daughter Brenda just happened to live in Blackfoot and worked as a psychiatric nurse at the State Hospital South. That day, an African-American man wearing sunglasses who appeared to be in his 30s came into the hospital and asked for Brenda. He matched the description of the man seen running away from the accident scene in Denver, and while I have no idea if his real name was actually Larry Monroe, that's how I'll be referring to him from now on. The hospital receptionist told Monroe that Brenda was not working that day, so she connected him with Brenda's supervisor. Monroe told the supervisor that Brenda's father was waiting outside and accompanied him to the parking lot where Don's truck was parked. According to the supervisor, Don was sitting in the passenger seat and was heavily intoxicated. He told Don that Brenda had left on a fishing trip with friends and was at a lake in the unincorporated community of Springfield, located about 15 miles out of town. The supervisor gave them directions to the fishing spot, and Monroe claimed to know where it was. Since Don was clearly too drunk to drive, Monroe got behind the wheel of the truck and drove him there. By this point, Brenda and her friends had given up on their fishing and went to a nearby saloon. Brenda would later recall seeing Larry Monroe enter the establishment and head towards the restroom, and about a minute later, Don came walking inside and went over to greet her. Brenda was surprised to see her father, but was disappointed that he had shown up drunk. Don started speaking with Brenda at the bar and became very emotional, saying that he didn't want to be alive anymore because he had cancer and was hoping to reunite with their mother in heaven. While this was taking place, Monroe exited the restroom and passed by Don. He appeared to have a disgusted, impatient look on his face, and Brenda noticed him leave the saloon and go sit in Don's truck. Brenda then advised her father to get a motel room and sober up, but he started becoming belligerent and challenging people in the saloon to fight him, which prompted Brenda and her friends to leave. As she was driving away, Brenda noticed Don exiting the saloon and letting his dogs out of the truck to run around, but this would turn out to be the last time she ever saw her father alive. The following day, Don's sister in Vancouver received a phone call from him. Don said he was currently in Park City, Utah, and asked her to wire him $200. Shortly thereafter, Don was seen picking up the money, and a man matching Larry Monroe's description was with him. The last confirmed sighting of Don took place on May the 14th, when he used a $50 bill to make a purchase at a convenience store in Heyburn, Idaho, and it would be less than 48 hours later when Larry Monroe got into the accident with Don's truck in Denver. Don remained a missing person for nearly 2 weeks, but on May the 27th, a couple was out walking in a desert area near the Miracle Hot Springs campsite in Twin Falls County, Idaho, just outside the town of Boole. They would soon come across a decomposing male body at the bottom of an embankment, which had apparently been tossed over a guardrail next to the road. When police arrived at the scene to recover the body, they also found a sack containing a bottle of wine nearby. The victim remained a John Doe for 2 weeks, before a connection was made to the accident from Denver, and he was positively identified as Don Smith. An autopsy would reveal that he was bludgeoned to death after receiving 2 blows to the back of the head with a blunt object, possibly the bloody jackhandle found in Don's truck. Curiously, Don's 2 Labrador retrievers were never found, but investigators came up with a theory for how he was murdered. Since the receipt from Don's purchase at the convenience store in Heyburn was found at the murder scene, it was suspected that Don was killed shortly after he stopped there on May the 14th. Don may have pulled over at a remote area in order to let his dogs out to run around, but Larry Monroe took advantage of the situation in order to bludgeon him to death. It's unclear if Don's murder took place at the same location he was found, or if Monroe transported his body to Twin Falls County, but after dumping Don's body over the guardrail and stealing his truck, Monroe then drove over 700 miles southwest to Denver. However, no one could figure out what happened to Monroe after he fled the accident scene. The case would be featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in March of 1989 and generated over 500 calls, but they failed to bring about a resolution. While the episode featured a composite sketch of the man known as Larry Monroe, he was never officially identified or tracked down, and Don Smith's murder continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Well, I'm sure you can find a number of cases in which an unfortunate victim was killed by someone they picked up hitchhiking, but the murder of Don Smith is definitely one of the most bizarre ones. It seems pretty obvious that the mysterious Larry Monroe was the perpetrator here, but the series of events which led up to this crime are very confusing. Overall, this is an incredibly sad story, as it's clear that even though his daughter Brenda had grown up without him, Don really wanted to be a father to her, and after so much missed time together, they finally reunited and built up a good relationship, which only got to last a few years before he was murdered. Since there isn't a ton of information available out there about this case, besides the Unsolved Mystery segment, certain elements of this story are a bit murky. The segment mentioned that Don was despondent because he was not well enough to work, and Brenda mentions that her father talked about having cancer during his emotional meltdown at the saloon. They never actually say that Don's cancer was terminal or anything, but I get the impression that it had a very depressing impact on Don's life, and may have influenced his decision to let Larry Monroe tag along with them during his cross-country road trip. Remember, Don's wife was originally planning to take the trip with him before she became ill, so perhaps Don came across Monroe hitchhiking somewhere and decided to pick him up because he was feeling lonely and needed some company. It's unclear when exactly the 2 men crossed paths, but it had to occur some time after Don dropped off his trailer in Las Vegas. When Don arrived in Blackfoot the following day, he was completely intoxicated, and Monroe was behind the wheel of his truck. I have no idea what prompted Don to start drinking to begin with, but he may have decided to cut loose, since he now had a designated driver. One newspaper article I read described Don as a quote-unquote recovering alcoholic. During her Unsolved Mysteries interview, Brenda said that her father would turn into a different type of person when he was drunk, though she said that didn't happen very often. It's unclear if Monroe helped Don get drunk, or if Don just decided to start drinking on his own, but this is the part of the story I find so baffling. On the surface, it seems like the most logical motive for Don's murder is that Monroe killed him in order to steal his money and his truck. However, the issue is that not only did Monroe decide to hang around Don for 2 or 3 days before this happened, but he also went out of his way to help him and allowed himself to be seen by several witnesses. I mean, if Monroe wanted to kill Don all along, he could have easily done it after he got drunk and was easy prey, but instead, Monroe drove him to Brenda's workplace and actually walked inside the hospital to speak to a receptionist and a supervisor in order to learn Brenda's whereabouts. He then drove Don to the saloon to see Brenda and seemed unconcerned about the fact that several witnesses could place them together. It just seems bizarre to me that Monroe would bother going through all this if he was planning to commit murder. I will say that the Unsolved Mysteries reenactment of the scene at the saloon has some pretty awkward moments, particularly when everyone there turns their head and goes dead silent when Monroe walks in through the front door, as if this was the first time they'd ever seen a minority enter their establishment. And while the real-life situation is pretty sad, I always crack up when the actor portraying Don goes through this drunken, emotional scene with Brenda before he suddenly turns around and says, "Anyone want to fight in here? I can whip anyone in here." What's pretty remarkable is that Brenda actually plays herself in the reenactment, acting out what must have been a pretty painful scene with an actor playing her father. Remember, this was the last time Brenda saw Don alive, and she was so angry that she didn't want to speak to him when she drove away. Given what ultimately happened, Brenda always regretted not showing more patience and understanding with her father, and wondered if things might have turned out differently if she had continued speaking with him. I've said this many times before, but it's pretty surreal watching the earliest seasons of Unsolved Mysteries, and often seeing the real people from these stories reenacting the events, which cannot have been easy. Anyway, from what I gathered, Don was always planning to drive to Vancouver, Washington to see his sister, but I get the impression that Brenda was not expecting him to drop by. If Don wanted to travel from Hemet to Vancouver, the quickest route would have been for him to drive the entire trip on Interstate 5 North, but he went out of his way when he traveled northeast to pass through Las Vegas before stopping in Blackfoot to see Brenda. Now, investigators expressed their belief that Monroe might have been familiar with the Blackfoot area because when the hospital supervisor gave him directions to Brenda's fishing spot, Monroe said he knew where it was. But again, why would Monroe go out of his way to help a man he was planning to murder? Brenda said that Monroe had a disgusted look on his face when he exited the saloon and sat in Don's truck, almost as if he was disappointed to see Don acting drunk and belligerent around his daughter. This is why I can't discount the possibility that something may have happened later on during the trip which prompted Monroe to kill Don. The next series of events in the timeline really confused me, as Don phoned his sister from Park City, Utah, and asked him to wire her $200. But the problem is that Park City is located 200 miles south of Blackfoot, whereas Vancouver is nearly 700 miles northwest, so what compelled Don to travel in the opposite direction? You could easily assume that Monroe convinced Don to get his sister to wire him some money so he could rob him, but that doesn't explain what they were doing in Utah in the first place. The last confirmed sighting of Don took place in Heyburn, Idaho 1 day later, which is over 200 miles northwest and on the route to Vancouver, and his body was ultimately found in a remote area of Twin Falls County, approximately 70 miles west of Heyburn. And the last confirmed sighting of Monroe was when he checked into a motel and got into the accident with Don's truck in Denver, which is over 700 miles southeast from there. So I'm just trying to follow the logic of Monroe's actions here. If robbery was the primary motive, he easily could have killed Don immediately after he received the money, but he stuck with Don for an extra day and traveled with him for hundreds of miles and even allowed him to spend some of the money at a convenience store. I don't know. I still wonder if this crime wasn't premeditated and something happened which set off Monroe and prompted him to kill Don. Remember, when Don was drunk at the saloon, he started challenging random strangers to fights, and when you consider that a paper bag containing an empty wine bottle was found in close proximity to Don's body, he very well could have been intoxicated at the time he was killed. Another big mystery in this case are the whereabouts of Don's Labrador retrievers. I wish I could tell all you dog lovers out there that they survived, but I don't believe they were ever found. I really hope Monroe didn't harm them, but it's my guess that the dogs were simply abandoned at a remote area in Idaho before or after Don was killed. It's possible the $200 Don received from his sister was of little consequence, and the primary reason Monroe decided to kill him was to steal his truck, but in a bizarre coincidence, Monroe was forced to abandon it when he got into an unplanned accident in Denver. If that hadn't happened, who knows how long it would have taken for the authorities to put the pieces of the puzzle together and figure out what happened to Don. When you consider that Monroe had to flee the accident scene on foot, I think he got extremely lucky that he was able to escape the area undetected, and I wonder if he hitched a ride with some other unsuspecting motorist. Until Monroe was caught, we may never know what his main motivation was for murdering Don, but all that matters is that he did it, and it was a brutal, senseless crime. This all took place before DNA testing was a major thing, but the authorities still had a lot of evidence to work with. It's surprising that Monroe still had bloody clothing and a bloody jackhandle in his possession over a full day after he committed the murder, so I have to wonder if they still have his DNA or fingerprints on file. If they do, then it's my guess that Monroe has not been arrested for another major crime, because otherwise, his DNA and fingerprints might have shown up in the system somewhere. Whoever he really was, it seems obvious that he was some sort of drifter who did not have any fixed address, which unfortunately would make him difficult to catch. It doesn't sound like investigators found any promising matches under the name Larry Monroe, but of course, that probably wasn't his real name. And even though they had a ton of information about this man, I see no indication that they've ever uncovered any potential suspects who might be a match to him, and who knows if he's even still alive today. But if by chance you happen to have any information about the unsolved murder of Don Smith, or think you might know the true identity of Larry Monroe, please contact the Twin Falls County Sheriff's Office. Anyway, now let's move on to our next case. Our second story begins in 1988, and our second victim is 23-year-old Philip and his Fraser. Philip lives in Anchorage, Alaska, and his parents are both physicians, so Philip is yearning to perhaps follow in their footsteps by taking a pre-med course at Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. His plan is to load all of his possessions into his 1983 Volkswagen Jetta and make the 2,300-mile road trip there, which would require him to cross through Canada. Philip would leave Anchorage on June the 14th and travel towards Canada's Yukon Territory, but after driving nearly 200 miles, he would get into an accident after hitting a soft shoulder at a road construction site and rolling over into a ditch. His car would be towed to the nearby community of Glen Allen to be repaired at a local gas station. Since Philip packed his camping equipment, he would spend the next 2 nights in a tent until his car was ready. Philip finally resumed his journey and reached the Beaver Creek border crossing on the morning of June 17th. At the time, Philip was carrying 2 handguns he owned, but after declaring them, both guns were seized by customs, as it was illegal for Americans to enter into Canada with firearms. After crossing over into the Yukon, Philip drove to Upper Liard before traveling south on Highway 37 and driving into British Columbia. The following day, after having traveled over 300 kilometers, Philip stopped at a remote establishment called the 40 Mile Flat Café. The reason for Philip's decision to stop there was unclear, but the cafe owner, Gay Frockledge, saw him and would later say that he appeared to be searching for something he had misplaced inside the car. Before Philip could leave, he was approached by an unkempt, heavy-set man who exited the cafe. He would be described as being in his early to mid-20s with strong body odor, rotten teeth, and a flabby belly. The man was a hitchhiker who had been dropped off at the cafe by a motorist driving a dark-colored pickup truck. When he went inside for a meal, he gave Gay Frockledge an uneasy feeling. Her daughter Tina was an employee there, but Gay did not want to leave Tina alone with this man. Tina was soon sent outside to pump gas for another customer who pulled in, and she said hi to Philip as she passed him by. The hitchhiker paid for his meal in Canadian dollars before leaving, and Gay said she saw him approach Philip's car and ask him for a ride. It appeared that Philip initially turned him down and the man started walking away. But shortly thereafter, Philip drove down the road and pulled up next to the man to speak with him. As Philip began driving away again, the man grabbed the passenger side door and aggressively pulled it open before Philip finally allowed him to climb inside the vehicle. As they drove away, Tina turned to her mother and said, quote, "He's going to live to regret the day he picked this man up," end quote. Well, the following evening at around 9:30 p.m., Philip's abandoned, burned-out Volkswagen would be discovered nearly 900 kilometers away at the Carpool Car Wash in Prince George. The establishment was a do-it-yourself car wash, and when no one else was around, someone had driven the vehicle in there and set it on fire. When police arrived at the scene and searched the car, they found no belongings inside, as Philip's luggage and camping equipment were missing, and even the stereo had been removed. Investigators used the vehicle identification number to trace the car to Philip, who was nowhere to be found, so Philip's parents were contacted in Anchorage, and a missing persons report was filed with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. On June the 27th, Philip's decomposed body would be discovered in a remote gravel turnaround off of Highway 37A, around 650 kilometers northwest from where his abandoned Volkswagen was found. He had been shot multiple times, and Philip's passport, wallet, credit cards, checkbook, and birth certificate were no longer on him. Naturally, after the RCMP heard the Frockledge's account of the unidentified hitchhiker who climbed into Philip's vehicle at the 40-Mile Flat Café, he immediately became the prime suspect. But after a composite sketch of this man was circulated throughout the media, more eyewitnesses would eventually come forward who recalled interacting with him. On June the 16th, a tourist from Ontario claimed he picked up a hitchhiker matching this man's description in Tok, Alaska, and remembered him saying he was a medical student who had traveled to the state to visit relatives. The tourist proceeded to drive the hitchhiker over the border into the Yukon and dropped him off in the village of Haines Junction. The following day, another motorist claimed he picked this man up at an establishment called Jake's Corner and drove him to the junction of Alaska Highway and Highway 37. This time, the hitchhiker claimed he was a medical student from Toronto who had traveled to Whitehorse, Yukon's capital city, to attend a friend's wedding. Apparently, he told one of these motorists that his name was Leonard, and the other that his name was Todd. However, the most interesting sighting of this man occurred on the evening of June the 18th, approximately 8 hours after he was seen with Philip at the 40-Mile Flats Cafe, and it occurred over 400 kilometers south near the village of Kitwanga. A couple named Eddie and Pauline Olson came across a stranded motorist standing outside a Volkswagen Jetta who claimed he was experiencing car trouble. The Olsons described the driver as a heavyset man who appeared to be nervous, and they offered to tow the car back to their house and let the man spend the night in their basement. The following morning, the man woke up and joined the Olsons for breakfast, telling them he originally hailed from Anchorage and that both of his parents were doctors, and he was on his way to attend college in the United States to study medicine. He also told the Olsons that he would be willing to sell them his car or at least trade it for a plane ticket. While Eddie expressed interest, he said he would need to wait until the following day so he could clear the transaction through customs, but the driver said he couldn't wait that long. He then proceeded to give the Olsons $20 in American currency for allowing him to spend the night, but they noticed that he pulled out 2 separate wallets in order to find the money. The man then headed outside to work on his car, and after discovering that the only issue was a broken fan belt, he proceeded to fix it and drive away within an hour. It would be about 12 hours later when the burnt-out Volkswagen was discovered nearly 500 kilometers away in Prince George. Since the man had provided the Olsons with a backstory which was exactly the same as Philip's, investigators suspected that the hitchhiker learned as much as he could about Philip before murdering him and proceeded to take over his identity. However, none of Philip's identification or personal belongings were ever found. The case would be featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in January of 1992, but even though the segment generated over 400 tips, the hitchhiker could not be found or identified. Philip's body was returned to his family, who proceeded to cremate him and scatter the ashes over Otter Lake in Anchorage, but after more than 30 years, his murder continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Best Fiends. I know that my biggest passion is true crime, but if I need a break from murders and missing persons cases, how about a game in which most of the characters are cute bugs, while the antagonists are not so cute slugs? That's why my go-to mental palate cleanser is the game Best Fiends. As you well know, putting together an episode of this podcast is often like putting together a massive jigsaw puzzle, since we're dealing with unsolved cold cases in which we attempt to figure out what really happened. Well, Best Fiends is similar in that it's a game with a story which involves solving challenging but fun puzzles. Most importantly, it is a casual game anyone can play, and it's even made for adults. You can spend as much or as little time as you'd like in the game, and it's very easy to be caught up in the bright colors and vibrant visual design. Every time I release one of these ads, I'm happy to provide updates about how far I progressed during the game. I'm pleased to say that the holidays gave me some more time to catch up, and I'm currently on level 121. I also find it to be an ideal companion during my commute to my day job, and since it does not require internet to play, it's great for traveling and can be played anywhere. So engage your brain with puzzles and collect tons of cute characters. Trust me, with over 100 million downloads, this 5-star rated mobile puzzle game is a must-play. So download Best Fiends free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the episode. Well, this is another horrifying story, and many people would rank this as one of the most haunting unsolved mystery segments ever produced. Since they filmed on location in the very scenic section of British Columbia where the crime took place, the segment effectively conveys the remote, isolated nature of the area. Perhaps the most vivid part is the reenactment where Philip initially turns down the hitchhiker's request for a ride, but then changes his mind and pulls up next to him while he's walking down the road. Since the hitchhiker is aggressively pulling on the door while Philip is driving away, you almost want to yell at Philip through the screen not to let him inside the car, but then they cut to this very ominous shot of the Volkswagen driving away into the distance, while Gay Frockledge is heard reciting her daughter's quote about how Philip will live to regret the day he gave this man a ride. Since the Frockledges were the only witnesses to this event and saw it from a distance, we may never know what exactly the hitchhiker said to Philip, which compelled him to change his mind. And I gotta say, the actor they cast to play the hitchhiker on Unsolved Mysteries was perfect, as not only did he look creepy, but he also did a very convincing job as coming across as pleasant and polite during the reenactments where he's staying at the Olsen's house. While looking through old articles at newspapers.com, it was quite interesting to see how they handled missing persons cases like this during the pre-internet age. A lot of British Columbian newspapers had tourist alert sections in which the RCMP asked travelers in the province to call certain people for an urgent personal message. When Philip was missing, they ran a few tourist alerts which read, quote, "Philip Innes Fraser of Anchorage, call your parents," so it's quite unsettling to see those and know that his body would soon be found. I think the big mystery is not who the killer was, but what compelled him to murder Philip in particular. When researching this case, I was surprised to learn that there were other motorists who came forward and remembered giving this hitchhiker a ride before he crossed paths with Philip, and it seems like their respective trips to the 40 Mile Flats Café were almost completely in sync with each other. This cafe is pretty much in the middle of nowhere, and when you consider the fact that Philip's trip was delayed by 2 days due to car repairs in Alaska, it's just rotten luck that he happened to meet up with his killer at this very remote location. There's also the fact that Philip was carrying 2 firearms which got confiscated when he crossed the Canadian border. That's not to say these guns would have saved Philip's life, but who knows if things might have turned out differently if he still had them. We know that the hitchhiker was dropped off at the 40 Mile Flats Cafe by the driver of a dark-colored pickup truck. While 2 motorists came forward who reported giving this man a ride, I'm not sure the pickup truck driver was ever identified. The hitchhiker apparently shared contradictory stories about himself to the other 2 motorists, as he told one that he was visiting relatives in Alaska, and the other that he was attending a friend's wedding in Whitehorse. He also apparently gave them 2 different names, Leonard and Todd. The Unsolved Mystery segment mentioned that authorities believed the suspect was familiar with the Toronto area and never elaborated why, but now I know this is probably because he mentioned being from Toronto. All of the information he shared about himself may have been completely false, but investigators hoped there might be some grain of truth in there to help them figure out who he really was. Of course, it's possible that either or both of these motorists were mistaken, and they actually picked up a completely different hitchhiker, but given what a distinct-looking person he was, I have a feeling this was the same guy. The first motorist picked up the hitchhiker in the small town of Tok, Alaska, and drove him over the border into the Yukon, so he may have been an American citizen. Of course, this should give you an idea of how different the world was in 1988, since there's no way he would have been able to enter Canada today without valid identification. It is interesting that the one detail he happened to share with both of the motorists he traveled with was that he was a medical student, which is exactly what Phillip was planning to be. When he eventually hitched a ride with Phillip and learned that he was on his way to take a pre-med course at college, this may have been what compelled him to murder Phillip and steal his identity. This is backed up by the fact that he shared Phillip's exact backstory when he spent the night with the Olsons, so it sounds like he wanted to learn as much as he could about Phillip before he killed him. As an Alaskan resident traveling through Canada who was planning to settle in Washington state, Phillip was carrying a whole bunch of identification and personal possessions, so sadly, that might have made him an ideal target. Once he killed Phillip and assumed his identity, I think the killer might have originally had a much different plan, but things went awry when he experienced car trouble and was forced to spend the night with the Olsons. I can't imagine how terrifying it must have been for the Olsons to find out that they picked up a guy who had just committed murder and allowed him to spend the night in their home. But the fact that he was very cordial with them and even gave them money for their troubles just adds another element of confusion to this case. The Olsons found it odd how he pulled out 2 separate wallets when he paid them $20 in American money, but since Gabe Frockledge said he used Canadian money to pay for his meal at the café, he likely got this $20 from Phillip's stolen wallet. He may have initially been planning to use Phillip's Volkswagen for a while, but since it broke down only hours after he stole it, he probably figured it was unreliable, which is why he came up with the idea of selling the car to the Olsons or trading it for a plane ticket. Since the hitchhiker had now interacted with 2 people who could identify him and connect him to the Volkswagen, I think that's probably what motivated him to set fire to the car later that night and destroy potential evidence. You may be wondering why he decided to drive 500 kilometers before he did this, but Prince George does have an airport, so for all we know, after he torched the car, the hitchhiker hopped on a plane and traveled to a new destination. He did have Phillip's passport, which was never found, but in 1988, he wouldn't have needed to use the passport to fly from Canada to the United States. But one of the most baffling unanswered questions is what happened to the rest of Phillip's personal belongings, such as his luggage, camping equipment, and car stereo. The car was completely stripped bare, so unless the killer dumped these items at another location and they were never found, I don't see how he could have carried all this stuff with him, especially if he was on foot. I believe the Prince George Airport was around 15 or 16 kilometers away from the car wash, so if he left on a plane, this guy would have needed to hitch a ride or grab a taxi in order to make it to the airport, particularly if he had Phillip's belongings with him. After his encounter with the Olsons, the hitchhiker may have abandoned his plan to assume Phillip's identity, because as far as I can tell, I don't believe Phillip's name has ever been flagged elsewhere. Unfortunately, it does not seem like investigators have ever turned up any promising suspects who might be the killer. If you search through online discussions about this case, you'll often see people bring up Michael Wayne McGray, a Canadian serial killer who is currently serving a life sentence for murdering at least 7 people, though he claims to have killed many more. McGray would have been a few weeks shy of turning 23 years old at the time Philip was killed, and he does bear a resemblance to the hitchhiker, but the problem is that McGray was in the midst of serving a 5-year sentence in a New Brunswick prison for robbery in 1988, so it definitely could not have been him. Unfortunately, it seems that much like the mysterious Larry Monroe, this hitchhiker was likely a drifter with no fixed address, which would have made him very difficult to track down. For all we know, he may be dead by now, or in prison for another crime. Unlike the Don Smith case, I don't get the impression that there's much physical evidence available to nail down a perpetrator, so after 30 years, this may be a difficult one to solve. All that being said, if you happen to have any information on the murder of Philip Fraser, please contact the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. However, if you have your own thoughts about what happened in either of these cases, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, we covered a story which was featured on the very first episode of Unsolved Mysteries involving a woman named Pat Mielbach and her attempts to find out if she was the biological daughter of automobile manufacturing pioneer John Francis Dodge. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take some time to catch up and thank our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon, dating all the way back to before the start of the holidays. And they are Brittany S., Sticky Sound Zine, Sarah, Steve E., Chase V., Lane T., Jonna G., Matt R., Elizabeth C., Dina S., Sarah S., JKM73, Astrid Maria K., John S., Mandolin B., and Martin M. Thank you all so much for your support. And before we bring things to a close, I'd like to play a trailer for a brand new podcast, Scene of the Crime, which will be exploring the infamous Delphi murders. Have a listen.
In Scene of the Crime Season 1, Delphi, we explore the February 2017 murders of Abigail Williams and Liberty German in Delphi, Indiana.
It could have been any one of our kids. It could have been anyone at the bridge that day.
If you haven't walked across the bridge, you don't understand, right?
Yeah, like that bridge is scary.
It is scary, and those railroad ties are rotted.
That bridge scares me. So for somebody to be able to cross it, he's moving well enough that he has to know the bridge.
He's done that before.
I remember when I was down there, they were mapping out like how everybody was going to search, and they kind of put everybody into groups. They told us just to look for anything that was suspicious or that we thought might maybe something, and that we weren't supposed to touch anything, that we were just supposed to call out.
As soon as I saw that, I knew something really bad happened. My biggest fear is that whoever did this would do it again. I don't want that to happen to another family, because I'm telling you, it's hell.
Those girls loved each other. They were good friends. Neither one of them left each other's side. Both those girls are heroes.
It's hard for me to believe that anybody could do something so bizarre and horrible and not feel compelled to tell somebody about it.
You'll hear from Abby and Libby's families, who share things from their perspective.
Before the words came out, I knew this was not good.
I had a feeling that it wasn't good. I wanted to be hopeful, but I think when they said the word bodies, it rushed into me and it told me they're not here anymore.
I think Becky told me Libby is afraid of the dark was when I really got concerned that something wasn't right.
People don't understand that our lives have turned 360 degrees and another 180. You know what I mean? It's hard to explain.
We all got shocked into the regular world's reality.
In the beginning, you had people acting like we took them out in the middle of nowhere and dropped them off on a trail, but the trails are what kids did.
My biggest fear was that I was going to recognize that voice, and it was going to be somebody we knew.
We watch the people around us, too, because we know that he's there somewhere. So it also causes us to trust people a little less.
The detectives were like, this is not going to take that long. It's a small town. Somebody's going to say something, and this is all going to be over soon.
People leave their doors unlocked, leave the keys in the car, garage doors open at night. I mean, that's just the way it was. Unfortunately, this changed all that.
Derek takes it day by day. Him and Libby were close. They were a lot alike. They had their own little bond. Derek struggled. He was looking for them when the killer was probably there. That is devastating to him. Him thinking, I couldn't save her.
You'll also hear from experts trying to help us understand the case. Paul Holes, the renowned former detective and DNA expert whose work helped bring the alleged Golden State Killer, Joseph D'Angelo, to justice.
Shortly after solving the Golden State Killer case, I did speak with an investigator that was involved with the Delphi murders.
Colleen Fitzpatrick, the renowned forensic genealogist and one of the founders of the DNA Doe Project.
Say, like, I meet you and we shake hands. We're out, somewhere at a store, and I haven't seen you in a while. We shake hands, give a hug, and, we talk a minute and go away. And then I go into a house, and shown that because we shook hands, when I touch that doorknob, your DNA might be on the doorknob.
Dr. Catherine M. Brown, an expert in child abductions and murders.
Child abduction murders in and of themselves are incredibly rare, but the abduction of 2 children at one time is even rarer. I've only seen a couple in my entire career.
Then Carroll County Prosecutor Robert Ives.
There is a lot of crime scene evidence. Some of it is somewhat odd. The crime scene was physically strange. There was no logical reason anybody would have known those girls would be there that day.
You'll also hear from the people tasked with trying to identify the killer.
Why Libby? Why Abby? Why Delphi? I say that because this is a classic example and a clear example that evil lives amongst us.
We are investigating this as a crime scene. We suspect foul play.
There's a likelihood that he has either done this before or will do it again.
A person with no conscience, a sociopath.
We do have some new information for you today. It's in the form of an audio file from the cell phone that Liberty German had with her at the time.
Guys.
Those 2 young girls were everybody's daughter. I refuse to accept evil as a standard bearer in American society. I believe we're one piece of the puzzle away from figuring out who this individual is. To the killer, who may be in this room. You want to know what we know, and one day you will.
Scene of the Crime, Season 1, Episode 1, will debut on January 2nd, 2020. Be sure to subscribe to Scene of the Crime wherever you listen to podcasts, so you don't miss an episode.
I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.